The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Dan Farber on what's next in Donald Trump's war on regulations and who will pay the price. Rita Bosworth on the Sister District Project and its plan to flip states from red to blue. Plus, Bill Press talks with nuclear arms expert Joe Cirincione about Iran and the path to war. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Dan Farber works at the intersection of constitutional law and the environment. He says Donald Trump's war on regulation sidelines science in the interest of industry profit. And if he has another 4 years, it will only get worse. And we say hello to Daniel Farber, the Show Sato Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley, and Faculty Director of the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. Daniel Farber, thank you for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you. It's great to have the opportunity.
Well, and our pleasure to have you with us. Deregulation. It has become a hallmark of the Trump administration so far, and you've been writing about how it will likely continue. Before we look forward, let's look back. What has Trump been able to accomplish, and I use that term loosely, so far in terms of dismantling environmental regulations?
Well, I should probably explain it's a lengthy process to create a new regulation, and it's also a lengthy process to eliminate a regulation. The government has to collect a lot of information and data, do a lot of analysis. They have to get comments and then write up a detailed explanation of what they're doing and why. So all of this takes several years for any significant regulation. They are working on that process, and they have been since taking office. And they're really now at the point where a lot of their major efforts are starting to emerge from the process or will be emerging in the next few months. Basically, what they've done is go after every regulation from the Obama administration that addressed climate change. And they're working on basically knocking all of them out. So I think we've already seen some of their proposals emerge from this regulatory process and start into litigation. And we expect most of the others to emerge within the next few months. So at that point, they'll be done with their part of it, and things will turn to the courts.
Well, and a major part of how Trump has been able to do this is due to his appointments to the EPA's Scientific Advisory Board. Explain for us exactly what is the role of the Scientific Advisory Board and how has its membership changed under Trump?
The Scientific Advisory Board is pretty much explained by its name. Its role is to offer scientific advice to the EPA about proposed regulations or policy initiatives. It's one of actually several different scientific groups that advises EPA. There's another group that is specifically dedicated to advice about air pollution regulations and so forth. But the Scientific Advisory Board is the sort of overarching group. The way it's been changed is a series of new appointments. One of the things that Scott Pruitt did early on was to eliminate most of the academic members of the advisory board, that is, people who had university appointments, which he did by claiming that if you received a research grant for the government, you had a conflict of interest. And those people were largely replaced by people who were either corporate scientists working for major corporations or consultants to industry. So what we now have is a board that's much more pro-industry and much more skeptical of the kind of science that EPA has used in the past.
An ongoing critique of Trump's environmental policy is that it's simply ignoring evidence. But some of this critique is coming from the Scientific Advisory Board itself. So what is happening to scientific evidence under the Trump administration?
Well, the Trump administration does not have a very good relationship with science, to put it mildly. The administration still continues to be unwilling to publicly admit the realities of climate change from the White House or anyone in a high-level position. So they have taken action of various kinds to downplay climate science. They have, as I said, stacked the Scientific Advisory Board as much as they were able to. They have basically gone to lobbyists for advice rather than talking to the scientists within the government itself, many of whom are, strongly opposed to the direction they're taking. And so basically the idea has been decide what you want to do first and then try to cobble up some kind of evidence that might support what you're doing and ignore as much as possible outside of that. In fact, they're considering a rule now that would keep EPA from considering a lot of public health related evidence. So overall, it's been a very fraught relationship. They haven't been completely successful in their war against science, as shown by the fact that the Scientific Advisory Board itself has sharply criticized some of their deregulatory efforts. But they're doing the best they can to sideline scientists.
They certainly are working hard at it. And Dan, you recently wrote about what might be next in terms of the president's deregulatory agenda, specifically air pollution. What seems to be his agenda here?
Well, I think the idea with air pollution is to at least freeze, if not roll back, air pollution requirements by ignoring more recent evidence that our air pollution standards are not strict enough. The goal here basically is to make things better for coal-fired power plants, to a lesser extent natural gas plants, and trucks and all kinds of other pollution sources. And they are just gearing up those efforts now. They're kind of in they started this stuff later than they did some of these other deregulatory efforts. So I don't think these are going to come to fruition right away. But maybe sometime later in the next year, we will see the outcome of that. Or if Trump is reelected, then we will see probably an even more intense attack on environmental regulations in a second term.
Well, and Trump has already begun the work to weaken the regulations that are in place to protect against air pollution. How much has he been able to accomplish so far?
Well, most of what he's done about air pollution itself has been kind of under the radar. The government has really stopped enforcing existing regulations to a large extent. So even where the regulations are still there, they're really giving polluters a free pass. They're issuing guidance documents of various kinds that water down regulatory requirements. Now, many of the climate change rules that they've attacked also have had big benefits in terms of reducing air pollution. So by rolling back the climate change rules, they're also, in effect, rolling back air pollution protections.
We're speaking with Daniel Farber, the Joe Cirincione Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley, also faculty director of the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. Dan, if the president is successful in weakening air quality standards, what will be the impact?
Well, basically, people will die. There was just a study that came out in the last week that showed that essentially, I think it was 26,000 people have died over the last 10 years. I think it was a 10-year period from air pollution due to coal-fired power plants alone. And the administration essentially is on a campaign to continue that. So we know that air pollution, especially pollution from ultrafine particulate in the air, we know that those are a major public health concern. And everybody agrees on that except the Trump administration. So if you look at the numbers, we're going to see more deaths. We're going to see a lot more asthma attacks involving children, more hospitalizations. It's a real public health issue.
Mm-hmm. And that's not an overstatement. I mean, there's evidence that it's already been happening, and here he wants to push everything, take away more of these regulations. I shudder to think what could happen with another 4 years under this administration.
You're not the only one. Let me say that.
Now, but on the brighter side of things, there has been significant pushback to the president's agenda, especially at the state level. Several states trying to take environmental protection into their own hands. Is this a strategy that could have meaningful impact?
Well, I think it can have and already has had a meaningful impact. States across the country have been taking action on climate change and trying to promote renewable, pollution-free energy. California's been a leader, but it's far from being the only state. I've just been doing a little research on what states are up to right now, and there are big things happening in Virginia with the new democratically controlled legislature there. New York has been moving along strongly. Colorado is engaging in some new initiatives. So really, it's states across the country, and all of that is really helpful in terms of climate change and in terms of conventional air pollution. The problem is that there are a bunch of other states that are not moving, and only the federal government can address that problem. And there are also limits to what states acting alone can do, because a lot of problems cross state lines. The Trump administration is actually now trying to limit what states are doing, and to push back against state policies that promote renewable energy. For example, push back against California's rigorous standards for air pollution and carbon emissions from new cars. So the states can really help. And I try to emphasize that because I think it's important for people to know there are positive developments going on. But state governments can't substitute for the federal government.
Yeah. And as you've written, the politics of the environment is also shifting. The public is increasingly focused on the issue, and it's not just Democrats. 60% of Republicans now believe that climate change is caused or exacerbated by humans. Is there a chance that Republicans will actually begin to challenge the president on the environment? I mean, they haven't challenged him on anything else, but is there some hope here?
Yeah. That's true. I do see some movement among Republicans, and particularly people in areas that are heavily impacted. There's been more realism in South Florida, for example, even among Republicans, because sea level rise is such an obvious threat to many low-lying communities, including Miami. So I think we are starting to see a thaw. I don't know, given what seems to be Trump's iron grip on congressional Republicans, whether that's going to translate into anything in the near future at the national level. It may start to have an effect in some Republican states at the state level, where I think at least some Republican leaders are starting to see that keeping their head in the sand is just exposing their own state to future trouble. So I do see some signs of a thaw in Republican attitudes, but it remains to be seen how much that will translate into real action.
Well, there has been some talk among Democrats about calling for a climate emergency. With some of this thaw, as you put it, from Republicans, is this the good time to do it, and is this a move you would support?
The politics are complicated, I think, because you don't want to create a backlash or even make moderate Democrats feel like you're going too far out on a limb. I do think that there's a sound argument for viewing climate change as an emergency, in the sense that not that it's something that came upon us unexpected, or that the effects will all be in a short period of time, like an earthquake or something like that, but in the sense that we have a limited amount of time, and every day of delay in addressing climate change is just increasing the amount of carbon that will be in the atmosphere for decades and decades to come. So I think there is an urgency factor that makes it reasonable to call it an emergency. I also think that doing so would unlock some legal powers for the president. It certainly wouldn't amount to a Green New Deal, or it wouldn't be a game changer, but it would allow the president to move forward on some things. So it's something I think that the presidential candidates, for example, now ought to be open to thinking about. There are other people who know way more than I do about public opinion and about sort of political dynamics, but I can see a real case for declaring a climate emergency.
Yeah, well, we can only hope, because time is certainly running out. Daniel Farber, the Show Sato Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley, and Faculty Director of the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Dan, thank you so much for your time with us. We'd love to have you back again with us soon.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely our pleasure. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, flipping states blue, one district at a time. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
As Ray Charles wailed in a song of true life blues, them that's got is them that gets, and I ain't got nothing yet. While the workaday majority of Americans continue to be mired in our low-wage economy, the precious few at the tippy top soared out of sight in 2019. They started the year wallowing in wealth, but by year's end, the 500 richest people saw their total haul increase by an average of $2.4 billion each. Indeed, some needed bulldozers to bank their increased wealth. Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, for example, piled up an extra $27 billion last year. Bill Gates of Microsoft added $22 billion to his stash, and even though Amazon czar Jeff Bezos dropped $9 billion last year in a divorce settlement, his fortune multiplied so much that he's still the world's richest person. Bear in mind that none of these moneyed elites did anything to earn these extraordinary bonanzas. They didn't work any harder, didn't get smarter, didn't add anything of value to society. They simply reclined in luxury and let their money make money. That's a dirty little secret of our rigged economic system. Unfettered inequality begets ever-expanding inequality. Another dirty little secret is that billionairism is hereditary. Right-wing media baron Rupert Murdoch, for example, doled out $10 billion to his 6 children last year. So, voila, thus were born 6 brand-spanking new baby billionaires who did nothing to reach the top of the world's financial heap except please Daddy. This is Jim Hightower saying, not only are the rich different from you and me, but the filthy rich are also different from the merely rich. In today's skewed wealth system, multi-billionaires don't need hard work and creativity. Their money does all the work to lift them above everyone else.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. The path to power runs through the states. That's why Rita Bosworth started the Sister District Project, an organization dedicated to turning states from red to blue. She says it's crucial to invest in state legislative races in order to reverse the course of the country. And we say hello to Rita Bosworth, founder and executive director of the Sister District Project, which is a grassroots organization dedicated to flipping states blue. Rita Bosworth, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, and our pleasure to have you with us. Now, you're a former public defender who left that work to do political work. How did that decision lead to the creation of Sister District?
Well, it actually happened in reverse, which is that I had been a public defender for 12 years. That's what I was doing when Donald Trump was elected. And in the wake of that election, I just kind of started Sister District. And as the organization gained traction, I realized that that was something I needed to be doing full time. And so the creation of Sister District actually led to me leaving my job as a public defender, but that certainly was not planned.
Mm-hmm. Now tell us more about how Sister District works.
The idea behind Sister District is that Democrats are a majority of the country, but they don't have a majority of electoral power. And there are a number of reasons for this, but I live in a very progressive part of California, in the Bay Area. And what really struck me in 2016 was how California had a great year that election. We elected a supermajority of Democrats to our state legislature. We were choosing between 2 Democrats for our open Senate seat. And yet the rest of the country just seemed to be going the opposite direction. But of course, we know that's not true because Hillary Clinton actually won the popular vote. It's just that she didn't win the Electoral College. So you have a majority of voters that do not have a majority of electoral power. And there are a lot of people like me who live in very blue areas who experience extreme frustration because we've already elected progressive representatives. We've done our part to do what we can in our districts. We know that we're part of the majority of the population of voters, and yet we're not seeing that reflected in terms of who has power. And so the idea behind Sister District is we want to tap into that energy, those resources, particularly in these very blue parts of the country, and channel them to places elsewhere in the country where a Democratic candidate is in a competitive election and needs a little bit of a boost in order to beat the Republican candidate. And the idea really is to bring balance back to government where the majority of voters have a majority of power. That is how a democracy should work. It's not working that way right now because there are structural barriers, such as the Electoral College, the Senate, gerrymandering. These are all institutions that create an avenue for a minority to take a majority of power. And so what we're trying to do is rebalance that and take the resources we have, which are a lot of people and volunteers in these very blue areas, and just redirect those to places where they can make a big impact.
The Electoral College alone is something that will forever leave me scratching my head. When somebody wins a popular vote and loses an election, that just doesn't make sense. Let's talk about your volunteers. What motivates them to work with you?
Well, I think, again, after the 2016 election, you had a lot of people that stopped to think about, why is this happening? As you stated, why in 2 of the past 5 presidential elections has the candidate who lost the popular vote been sworn into office as president? That's just fundamentally unfair. And the election of Donald Trump was just a real shock to the country and also to normal citizens who had just kind of been going along their merry way, not maybe paying a whole lot of attention. And they stopped to think, why is this happening? And so I think that, in 2016, when Donald Trump won, the Democrats' immediate response was, well, we need to really gear up to flip Congress in 2018. And that wasn't wrong, because in 2016, it definitely seemed like Congress was the most likely place that we could win back some power in the 2018 election cycle. But for me, the issue was, well, wait a second, we've got to go further than that, because you cannot win back a long-term and sustained majority of power in Congress if you don't win back power in the states, because states control redistricting. This is part of how we've gotten into this imbalance to begin with, is that you have state legislatures in 35 states who control the redistricting process, and they are able to draw the congressional voting districts. And so again, over the years, we have seen, particularly in this decade, we have seen Republicans repeatedly take an outsized share of representation in Congress because they have so much power in the states. And so the people that volunteer with Sister District are people that kind of understand that next level of, we can't win this fight by just pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into Congress every 2 years. In order to win, we actually have to pour our resources into state legislative races, because those determine what the congressional races are going to look like. And it's going to be much better for us in the long term if we invest in these state races. And so I would say that the folks that Sister District's work really resonates with are people who understand that on a deeper level, these decisions and these where power is being held, this stuff is determined at the state level.
Yeah. Well, and this is you build from the bottom up, right? And I mean, and that's what you're doing by going to the state level and that kind of thing. But how do you decide which races to focus on?
We have a number of kind of different rubrics that we use. The first thing that we look at, of course, is which states are having elections in any given year. And that varies year to year. Obviously, the even years, there are more states having elections. The odd years, there are fewer states. But there are always states having elections. It's not like the federal election cycle where it's really a two-year cycle. So first, we're looking at who's having elections. Next, we look at states that fall into one of three buckets. So the first is states where we think we can flip a state chamber blue by just winning between 1 and 4 seats. Those are our blue flips. States where we need to hold a chamber blue, where Democrats have a fragile majority, but we need to hang on to it. Those are our blue holds. And states that are so badly gerrymandered that we have got to start making inroads in order to lay the foundation to flip those chambers down the road, even though that may be a multi-cycle process. Those are our blue inroads. So we have our blue flips, blue holds, blue inroads, and we look at the states that are having elections in any given year, which ones fall into one of those buckets. And then once we've identified the states, we drill down and look within the chambers and the districts to determine which seats we think are flippable, both based on the quantitative data, but also based on the qualitative data. Is this a candidate that's electable? Is this a candidate that's talking about the issues that voters in this area care about? There are a lot of things that the numbers on paper can't tell you. So we think it's really important to look at those quantitative numbers, but then also evaluate what people on the ground are saying about these candidates to come to figure out who it is that we want to support, who we think we can have. We think we can win, but we think it'll have the biggest impact. We don't just want to win a seat to win a seat. We want to win a seat where we can flip an entire chamber or create a Democratic trifecta state or bust a Republican supermajority. So we go for these very strategic states and races within the states where we think that by just winning a couple of these races, we can actually have a big impact for Democrats.
We're speaking with Rita Bosworth, founder and executive director of the Sister District Project. Rita, you've had many successes, and it's probably hard to choose, but what are some that you're extremely proud of?
Well, I think that, part of our successes, of course, are these individual races that we've been able to support, and the razor-thin margins by which some of our candidates have won shows us that we're in the right place, doing the right things, and that our volunteers made the difference. But I think more than that, holistically, what I'm so proud of is that we're now going into our fourth election cycle, because our first election cycle was 2017. And we still have the same volunteers that were with us from the very beginning. We have a very high retention rate, and our organization continues to grow. And what I was worried about after the Trump election was that people would be outraged for 6 months or a year, and then they would just lose interest. And that has not happened. And that is a testament to, obviously the existential threats that this administration poses to our country and our citizens, which is keeping everybody engaged, but also to the fact that people care. And most of our volunteers are people that had never engaged in politics prior to the 2016 election. And yet here we are over 3 years later, and they are still doing this work. And so I'm extremely proud of our organization and our volunteers for sticking with it and actually improving year to year the services that we provide. We just keep getting better and better. And that to me is a real success.
It's really, really encouraging, a story like that when it's, the group is not only still a lot of the same folks, but it's growing and that's probably the best success you can have. How are you focusing your efforts for 2020?
Well, 2020 is obviously going to be one of the biggest years of our lives, and it's hard to even fathom what's coming our way, but we are sticking with the same strategy that we've had before, that we've now been through 3 years worth of elections with, which is looking at those states that are having elections that are opportunities for either flipping a chamber blue or making inroads into these badly gerrymandered states. Now, of course, 2020 is particularly important because this is the year of the census. And that means that whoever we elect to state legislatures this year, these are the folks that are going to be in office to make the maps for the next redistricting cycle, which will, these maps that are drawn next year in 2021 are going to last for the next decade. So it could not be more important to be in state legislatures this year, because what happens this year will stick with us for the next decade. And so we are specifically looking at those states where the state legislature controls redistricting and where we need to win back power in order to make sure that the people in those states and in our country have fair voting maps going forward. That's really what we're after.
Well, and of course, so much attention now is directed at Washington. But as you're pointing out, on your website, in fact, you make the statement, win power in the states to win power everywhere. So what do you want voters? What do you tell voters so that they understand about state elections and why they matter?
Well, there's a couple of things. First, I like to start with a simple example, which is that in 2016, North Carolina went for Donald Trump by less than 50%. They went for him by about 49.7%, so less than half. They at the same time elected Democratic governor. So that is a state that I think we can fairly classify a purple state. That's 50-50. And yet in 2016, 10 of their 13 congressional representatives were Republicans. And that's because the Republicans control the state legislature, and they gerrymandered those congressional maps to give themselves 3 times as much power as the Democrats in a state where really the power should be split. That's an egregious example, but that's happening in states all over the country where Republicans control the state government. And that adds up. And so for people who think to themselves, well, I live in California, what's happening in the state legislature in Virginia or North Carolina or Pennsylvania, that doesn't really concern me. It's not true, because what's happening in the state legislature in those states is affecting representation in Congress, and what's happening in Congress is affecting us no matter which state we live in. And so that's one of the ways to explain why states are so important. The other reason that's particularly pressing right now is that given what's happening with our federal government being kind of taken over by the extreme right wing of the Republican Party and the judiciary being reshaped to fit the mold of the extreme right wing, we are not going to see any movement on policies like in the environment, healthcare, women's rights, voting rights, gun violence prevention. None of that stuff is going to happen at the federal level or in the courts. And if anything, I think we're going to continue to see the Supreme Court ignore or erase federal rights, constitutional rights that we have established over the past century. And so all of those issues are going to be kicked to every single one of the states. That's where it's going to happen for the foreseeable future. If we want to make progress on climate change, we're going to have to do it in state legislatures. If we want to protect a woman's right to choose, we're going to have to do it in state legislatures. If we want to reduce gun violence, we're going to have to do it in state legislatures. That's the only place where it's going to be able to happen for the foreseeable future. And so I think that when you look at it that way, you get in a position where you think, how can I not get involved in states?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And as you were talking about North Carolina, and you mentioned Virginia in there as well, which is where I am. Back in November, you wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post titled "2020 is the year for Virginia to finally ratify the Equal Rights Amendment." Number one, it blows me away that that's still hanging out there. But at any rate, if that happens, Virginia would become the 38th state to pass the amendment, which is the bar to pass for a constitutional amendment. Why is the ERA still needed, and do you really think Virginia will come through?
Well, yeah, those are two big questions. So why is it needed? I mean, women have made progress over the decades, but of course there's still a wage gap. Of course there's still discrimination in the workplace, and just generally, it's absurd to me, as you just stated, that the Constitution of the United States does not explicitly treat women as equals. And that matters. What the Constitution says matters. What people read about matters. We know that girls who see women running for office, that matters. That shapes them. I grew up in a time where I didn't necessarily think or know that there were explicit barriers to me being able to have a career and go as far as I wanted to go. But certainly everybody I saw around me who was mainly men who were in positions of power, that influenced what I thought about what I could achieve. So it's not just words on a piece of paper. It means something, and we need that in order to continue advancing. Now, in terms of whether Virginia will come through, I certainly hope they do. I think that they have the votes. There's a larger problem, which is, of course, that the ratification was supposed to happen some years ago. And so if Virginia does pass the ERA, which, again, I hope they do, we're then going to have lots and lots of litigation from folks who do not want women to have equal rights, claiming that the timeline has expired. There are also 5 states who have since rescinded their ratification. So unfortunately, even if Virginia passes the ERA, there's still going to be a lot of barriers to actually getting that signed into law. And given our political environment and our judicial environment right now, I'm not completely optimistic that it would happen, but it's still worth pushing forward on because it's so important. And, it took women 70 years to get the vote. 70 years. 3 generations of women had to keep fighting and fighting and fighting to get the vote. And at the end of the day, it came down to literally one guy in one state, in one chamber, who voted yes on it. That's the only reason women have the vote. It was that close. And it took 70 years. So I try to think of these things in the long term. I try to remind myself that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, and we just have to keep pushing on this stuff in order to eventually get it through.
Rita, we need to grow Sister District a little bit more. How can our listeners get involved with Sister District?
We would love to have all of your listeners join Sister District. Go to our website at sisterdistrict.com. It's very easy to sign up to volunteer, and it doesn't obligate you to do anything. If you give us your name, your email address, your zip code, we can then match you up with the team that is already operating in your area. You'll just get a welcome email telling you who they are and starting to give you information about the activities that they're doing. You can do it from anywhere in the country. You can do it from your home. You can go meet in person. We try to make it as easy as possible to participate. And all you have to do is sign up. We don't send a large amount of emails. We just kind of send you the information that you need to get started, and it's up to you how involved you want to be. So I would encourage everyone to go to the website, sisterdistrict.com, sign up, see what we're about, and we would welcome you aboard.
sisterdistrict.com. Yeah, when you're sitting there having your coffee and you got your slippers on, it's that easy to go, get signed up, and get involved. Rita Bosworth, founder and executive director of the Sister District Project, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Rita, we appreciate your time with us and would love to have you back again with us soon.
Many thanks.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Is Donald Trump leading us into a war with Iran? Bill Press talks with Joe Cirincione, one of the leading nuclear policy experts in the country.
This is very bad. You have to go back to the prelude to the war in Iraq to think about what this could lead to and the kinds of projections we had back then that proved to be an underestimation of how bad it could be. This is clearly the biggest foreign policy crisis of the Trump administration. And I would argue you'd have to really go back 40 years to think about this kind of crisis that it could become. Because the war with Iran will make the wars with Iraq and Afghanistan look like warm-up acts. This could get quite big quite quickly.
Susan Rice, in an op-ed in the New York Times, former national security advisor, said it's hard to imagine that this could end up with any other consequence than war with Iran.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Yes, I do, unfortunately. And I've been working on avoiding war with Iran for, as you know, a good 12 years since I became president of Plowshares Fund. It's been one of our big objectives. And we succeeded. We helped get the U.S. and Iran to negotiate the anti-nuclear agreement. We defended that agreement against people who wanted to tank it. We avoided the war that many people wanted. But those people who wanted war, they never gave up. And they've been pushing this ever since. There's a great article by Adam Weinstein in the New Republic this week talking about Pompeo and his long-term campaign to do this war. It has nothing to do with Soleimani. It has nothing to do with threats of imminent attack. They have wanted to overthrow this regime. They're well-funded. There's a network of think tanks and organizations here in Washington that have been pushing it. As you know, Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister still of Israel, has been promoting it. The leadership of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have been pushing it. Well, it looks like they're going to get their wish. Trump has been resisting this, interestingly enough.
Right.
And many of our donors,
until now.
And many of our donors, we're a foundation. We accept donations to do things like this, advance peace and avoid war. And they thought, no, Trump's never going to go. Trump doesn't want to go to war. It's not in his interest to go to war. He'd lose the election if he started a new war. And we were somewhat sanguine that Trump himself would prevent this from happening. But for whatever reason, we're now stumbling into the catastrophe that many of us had hoped to avoid.
Which raises a question, I think, central to this discussion. What kind of confidence can the American people have in Donald Trump as a leader at a time like this, when how he would approach it, what skills he brings to it, what patience he brings, what reason he brings to it? But not only Donald Trump, but the people around him.
None whatsoever. Remember, this is a man who's told 15,436 lies and counting, according to the Washington Post. He has decimated the national security apparatus of the United States. I've lost count of how many secretaries of defense and Homeland Security advisors and national security advisors we have, but about a dozen people have cycled through those offices. He's just helped weaken our alliances, and the attack on General Soleimani weakens them further. He has shown no discipline, no ability to absorb the kind of complex information that he could have every day from the intelligence agencies, a man of great impulse, a megalomaniac, a narcissist, obsessed with bettering Barack Obama's legacy. I mean, one thing that people point to about this, he was still jealous about the attention that Barack Obama got for killing Osama bin Laden, and he didn't feel he got enough credit for killing Baghdadi, the ISIS leader, and so this was another scalp he wanted to show that he was stronger and better than Obama. You know, it's a very, very bizarre president presiding over a fractured national security apparatus. That's one of the big arrows that are pointing towards war, is the unreliability of the national security apparatus in the United States to control an unstable, unpredictable president.
Everybody agrees that Soleimani was an evil man.
Yes.
So could you say this is a guy who planned several attacks which ended up killing who knows how many Americans, and that thereby his end was probably planning more attacks, that his assassination was justified?
No, I don't think it was justified at all. There's a difference between killing a terrorist leader like Baghdadi or Osama bin Laden, who doesn't have a nation to mourn them, and killing a military leader of a sovereign state who was visiting an allied nation or associated nation, Iraq, to talk to the leadership of that country. Remember, we killed an Iranian military official in Iraq, as he was about to, according to the Iraqi president, come pay a visit to the Iraqi president with a diplomatic mission, not to plan attacks, according to the Iraqi president, but to convey some details of some diplomatic exchanges that were happening, ironically, between Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq. Iraq was trying to broker some agreements here. So is this an evil man? Did his actions kill U.S. troops? Yes, but so did North Korean leaders, so did North Vietnamese leaders, so did the Chinese, so did the Soviets, and these are the people you talk with, right? So if you want to reach agreements with your adversaries, you have to have discussions with them, even though they are evil, even though they have committed unspeakable acts. So no, the fact that this man killed Americans does not automatically make him the just subject of a U.S. assassination effort.
You've mentioned the person who is probably the architect of the assassination of General Soleimani, Secretary of State Pompeo.
Yes.
The one who seems closest to Trump during all this. Okay, so in the day after the assassination of Pompeo on television, Sunday morning, all the shows, right, said, first of all, that there was an imminent danger of attacks that he was planning, imminent danger.
Yes.
The world is a safer place without him, and that this actually decreases the chance of conflict.
Well,
any shred of truth in anything Pompeo says?
No. Let's take that. Let's unpack that just a little bit, because there's kind of two aspects here. Is what he's saying true? And the answer is no. And it's sort of self-evident. At the same time, he's asserting that Americans are safer. He's telling Americans to leave Iraq, to leave Yemen, to leave the region. He has also united the region around Iran. Remember, just a few weeks ago, there were major demonstrations in Iraq against Iranian presence. Those have now ended. There were major demonstrations in Iran against the government. Those have now ended. The demonstration of support for Qasem Soleimani was in the millions of people in the streets of Iran, hundreds of thousands in the streets of Iraq. You can manipulate crowd support, think Trump inauguration, or rally. You can get tens of thousands of people to do almost anything, but millions of people? No, that's something profound. And so you see this thing is already backfired. Having said that, let me say that I do think that the administration is winning the narrative. And I think they're winning the narrative with the media, the help of the media, who refuses to ask some of the tough questions and bring on alternative voices to the normal Washington crowd here. And by that I mean they have discipline, they have a disciplined party, they have their own state media than Fox News that are hammering home a very simple message. Iran is a terrorist nation. This was a terrorist leader of a terrorist nation. He was plotting to kill Americans. We were acting in self-defense. It's a good thing that we killed him. If Iran tries to retaliate, we will strike back even harder. That is a message that is very simple to say. Look how quickly I said it. Mm-hmm. And it resonates with a lot of Americans. So I see there's a new poll that just came out today that showed that only 43% of the American public support the killing of Soleimani. I was really surprised to see that. That's basically Trump's core support.
Right.
But it's only 43%. However, if Iran should strike back at the United States, well, it's very, very hard for the American public not to support a military action after an attack, even if we were the ones who started this escalatory cycle.
Right. Is there any doubt that Iran will retaliate?
I don't think so. I think it's impossible for them not
When,
to.
how, where?
Well, the new leader of the Quds Force, Imal Ghani, who was put in place by Ayatollah Khamenei just within 24 hours. The idea that Soleimani was irreplaceable. Unique, yes. Irreplaceable, no. This is a very large organization. And Ghani has been at the right hand of Soleimani for decades now. So I don't think they're going to lose a beat. This is not a gain for U.S. national security, killing this one man. It doesn't diminish Iran's capabilities. And they have so many ways they can strike back at us. Let me just count the ways. And some of the things they've already done. Attack Saudi oil facilities. There was a cheap, simple attack involving a few dozen rockets, scared the bejesus out.
But you say they've already done that.
They've already done it. Attack tanker traffic in the Persian Gulf. Already done it. But those were light attacks. That was a taste of what they could do. They could shut down the Straits of Hormuz overnight. About 1/3 of all tanker traffic goes through the Straits of Hormuz. About a fifth or a sixth of U.S. of oil globally. You do that, you start to push the global economy into a recession. You do that, stock markets sink. And by the way, so do Trump's re-election prospects. But That's just one of the things they could do. There's also, as they've said, their forces are within reach of approximately 35 U.S. bases and facilities in the region. They've already started activating their proxy forces. The Quds Force is global. People have said that it makes al-Qaeda look like amateurs. So you could see U.S. economic targets, U.S. economic assets targeted around the world, whether it's Kentucky Fried Chickens in Vietnam or Trump hotels. You could see them targeted. And finally, and this is the new wrinkle that has been tested but not yet exercised, cyber warfare. The Iranians, after we attacked them with the Stuxnet virus that crippled their centrifuges, they stood up the Iranian cyber army, and it is quite formidable. They've already penetrated U.S. facilities, and they could do so, again, with devastating consequences.
And you pointed out these attacks could come from Iran itself or maybe more likely from their proxies, which they have many.
Many. And I would suspect they will try to hide direct Iranian involvement. I don't think that will be successful, but they will try to give some deniability to the actions.
You mentioned the role of Plowshares Fund in the Iran nuclear deal, 2015, right, under President Obama. Did all of this start to unravel with Trump's pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal?
Absolutely. There's a direct line to pulling out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran anti-nuclear deal, and everything that has followed since. Remember, there were no rocket attacks on U.S. forces while we had this Iran nuclear deal. There was not an expansion of Iranian influence while we had the deal. The Iranian problem was contained. We had issues, but they were all manageable issues. Once you pull out of that deal, and once you signal that you want to have a coercive policy towards Iran, that you're going to have a policy of what they call maximum pressure, then you start to engage in economic warfare with Iran. And we are trying to strangle their economy for the purpose of toppling the government, right? So that is war. That is economic warfare. Iran shows great patience in this. They don't leave the deal. They don't violate the deal. They stay in full compliance with the deal for about a year. And then that's when you start to see Iran pushing back to show that there are limits. But even so, their movements are kind of calibrated. There's some, like the tanker attacks. Nobody died, right? No, the commerce wasn't stopped. It was a warning to them. These kind of attacks. It's only very, very recently, as the U.S. has kept pushing, that you've seen the Iranians go a little further. But even so, the rocket attack that supposedly triggered this killed the first American. It's been years since an American died at the hands of an Iraqi militia linked to Iran. But that was a relatively minor incident, probably not planned by the Iranians, but that was the excuse that some in the State Department were looking for to start pushing towards a more kinetic response, as they say. And
now, perhaps not definitively, but in effect, Iran has said the deal's off. We're not going to. I mean, they did leave an off ramp.
That's exactly right.
But I was going to ask you. So, what is the impact of that announcement by Iran?
Right. So, this just to the nuclear part of it.
Right.
So, this is the deal that, remember, rolled back the Iranian nuclear program.
15
they ripped
years
out.
At least.
Yeah. They froze it. Put it under lock and key with inspections. The strongest nonproliferation agreement ever negotiated, in my opinion. A big success. Avoided the war, solved the problem, at least for 2 decades. Okay? So now Iran has said, look, under this agreement, we have the right to exceed the limitations imposed on us if the other party, the United States,
walks away,
is not fulfilling their obligations. That's what they say. That's their claim. And there's some truth to that. And what they've done now is announced their 5th action, exceeding the limits. This is the most significant one. They said the limits on centrifuges is off. We're going to start installing new ones, and we're going to start stockpiling the uranium gas. What that means is they get closer to the point where they could sprint to a bomb. It's nothing we have to worry about now. They cannot make a bomb now. It would take them at least a year from right now to amass enough uranium for the core of a bomb, and probably a year after that to build one. So it's not an urgent threat. But they've left the door open. They said, just today, as we're recording this, the Foreign Minister Zarif said, we are ready to come back into compliance if the U.S. does, if we get this. So, as Miracle Max says in The Princess Bride, it's not all dead. There's a difference between all dead and mostly dead. Mostly dead means you're slightly alive.
Yeah.
And so the deal is slightly alive, meaning if we can somehow keep it alive for the next year, a Democratic president could come in and rejoin it, bring Iran back into compliance, and that architecture, that framework is there to help solve at least that nuclear part of the Iranian problem.
Could that be the off-ramp we're looking for?
It's the off-ramp a year from now, but I don't think the Trump administration is interested in an off-ramp. And that's what worries me.
In fact, the president said and repeated today, boy, if they strike us, we're going to hit them hard, we're going to hit them fast, 52 sites, and including cultural sites.
Right. He had committed 2 war crimes, or he declared his intention to commit 2 war crimes in the last day, which is disproportional attack. Nope, you can't do that. You can only defend yourself in proportion to the attack. And 2, the Hague Convention, which George W. Bush helped pass the Senate in 2008, prohibits the targeting of cultural sites for obvious reasons. You're trying to restrict the damage that wars can cause. Trump either doesn't know or doesn't care about this and just argues that, there are no rules in war. We're going to do whatever it takes. We're going to hit you as hard as we want. It's a very New Jersey thug approach to international relations.
He knows that. To what extent do you think this is just puffery on Trump's part?
Oh, I think it's mostly puffery, but it's puffery with consequences. Because remember, when he gives an order, the military executes it. So the kind of thing you might say at Mar-a-Lago when you're not president of the United States, we should kill that SOB. You say it when you're president, it's like, who will rid me of this meddlesome priest? Well, the military hears that order and they have to go execute it. They freaking proposed it foolishly, thinking no one would take this option, right, in the briefings, but he does take it. And so that's a difference between, braggadocio and orders. And unfortunately, we may not see the worst. I mean, he's getting a feel for this now, right? I mean, look at what he just did. He reached out and touched Soleimani. He got him. And so why not do it again? Why not do it to somebody else? Why not do it in larger force? Could that extend to pressing the nuclear button? Yes, it could. He has the same authority to declare that we're going to have a nuclear strike in Iran as he does that we're going to have a drone attack on an Iranian military commander.
Bill Press talking with Joe Cirincione, president of the Plowshares Fund. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Dan Farber, Rita Bosworth, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.